Hey guys, this is Nick, and this is your Linux, open source, and privacy news fix for the first half of July 2021. In this one, we have Audacity collecting user data, Github training their AI on open source code without prior notice, Deepin supporting Android apps out of the box, and Steam introducing their Steam Deck handheld PC running Linux. Let's dig in right after I tell you about today's sponsor. Thanks to Linode for sponsoring this video. Linode is the largest independent cloud service provider, meaning they provide hosting that you can use to run your own servers, whatever you need one for. I use Linode to host my own Nextcloud instance, but thanks to their one-click apps, you can deploy any type of server in one click. If you're a gamer, you can easily start your own Valheim, Minecraft, or CSGO server. But if you're looking for a VPN, you can also one-click deploy your own, using WireGuard or OpenVPN, and you can ensure there is no middleman trying to intercept what you're connecting to. Linode is affordable and has consistent pricing with data centers all over the globe. You can upgrade your servers in one click, just as I did on my Nextcloud instance to add more storage, and you have real humans behind it all to talk to 24/7 by phone or support ticket. Even if you use the cheapest plan available, which is $5 a month, by the way. They also have very detailed documentation if you don't like talking to other human beings, which I know I'm not a fan of. If you use the link in the description to sign up, you get a $100 credit to use on your own servers, so head over there and give it a go. I am certain you won't regret it. Okay, let's begin with the Linux news. Deepin 20.2.2 was released, and a minor version like that wouldn't usually warrant a specific mention here, but the changes in this new release are pretty major. Deepin revamped their whole app store, including support for Android containers and applications. Now this will only work on kernel version 5.10, but it will expand to 5.12 in the future. This is pretty major, and I definitely will have to see how they implemented that, and if only Android apps available through the store will run, or if you can run anything you would like. We don't really know how these run either, so expect a dedicated video to take a look at that in the near future. Deepin now also supports Secure Boot since they've obtained a certificate for it. It looks like the GNOME developers are planning a big redesign for their Adwaita theme. The default GNOME look will apparently do away with borders and backgrounds around buttons and controls. It will also use a highlighted style for the close button on the windows. Button text would be put in bold, with accent colors being used for the default actions, switches, and checkboxes. Of course, this redesign is still subject to being revised, completely forgotten, or changed significantly. But it's nice to see that, even though GNOME developers want to ensure that developers and users use Adwaita and forget about theming, they're not just sitting on the current version of Adwaita, which, in my opinion, looks and feels a bit dated and padded. GNOME 40 has finally landed in Ubuntu 21.10. The team has decided not to use it for 21.04, as they didn't have enough time to integrate the Yaru theme and their own dock with the layout changes that GNOME 40 brought. But now we can see that it all seems to work out pretty well. Of course, Ubuntu is currently keeping their dock on the left side of the screen and not on the bottom, and made changes to accommodate for that. But it doesn't look like it's hurting the user experience that GNOME 40 brings. The workspaces are horizontal, and the activities view is visible by default when you log in to help you orientate yourself. I quite like what GNOME has done with GNOME 40, and I think it's nice to see it adopted without too many changes by Ubuntu. Not completely Linux related, but it still might be interesting to see how this affects the growth of the Linux desktop. Microsoft announced Windows 365, basically their own way of logging in through a remote desktop protocol to a Windows device from a web browser. This means that you'll be able to access a full Windows PC from any device, including a smartphone, a tablet, or a Linux computer. Windows 365's main advantage seems to be the capacity to generate at scale on-demand Windows PCs for a lot of workers and employees to use as their main computing device. In that case, running that on a Linux-based desktop would make sense. You wouldn't buy a Windows device to run a Windows OS through RDP. It will be interesting to see how that thing works and the changes it brings to the desktop market share of Linux, if any. The Pine 64 has opened up the Pine Time for purchase at $27 US. This open smartwatch is pre-flashed with the InfiniTime firmware. Don't expect to have hardware that looks or feels as nice as an Apple Watch or a Galaxy Watch, but it's a great tool for tinkerers and people who want to use a fully Linux-based device ecosystem. Of course, the situation with this watch will be similar to the one with the PinePhone. It's still more of a tinker's dream than a fully fledged replacement for another alternative. But at that price, if you're interested in trying it out, there is no real reason not to snag one. Moving on to the open source news, GitHub launched Copilot, its AI-powered tool to help developers autocomplete and write code faster. This new tool has created quite the controversy, as it's been trained in secret on all the open GitHub repositories, basically feeding on open source code to train its algorithm. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on whether this is even legal, and even though I'm no lawyer, from my understanding, Copilot doesn't breach any license or copyright law. What it's doing is fair use of open source code, and it's nothing that a human being couldn't already do themselves. I personally think it's really unethical though, as this code might be open for humans to see, look at, learn from, and edit, but the open source licenses have never been written to handle AI and machine learning. This, in my opinion, shows a really poor understanding of the principles and ethics of the open source community by GitHub and by extension Microsoft. It could have been done in a more tactful and respectful manner than just telling everyone after the fact that their repos had been pilfered by this AI. Tobias Bernard, one of GNOME's prominent developers, wrote a blog post about why GNOME sometimes removes options and why this is the path they choose to tread. Basically, the reasoning is that each feature and preference has a cost in terms of development time, maintaining it, ensuring it keeps working after each update, and a cost for the user, as each option and preference is a distraction from actually using the software itself. He says GNOME doesn't do hacks and prefers identifying the root cause of an issue and fix it than letting the user fix it themselves by selecting an option or another. There are also some more personal views that I don't completely share, like system-wide theming being a broken idea, or shells extensions being a niche thing, when most distros include at least one of them by default. Still, it's an interesting blog post, and I'm sure GNOME detractors won't be convinced that the GNOME way is the right way, but it's always good to put things into perspective and explain the why of doing stuff. Now, moving on to applications. Audacity created an uproar when they announced their new plan on collecting telemetry data and their new privacy policy. People have been calling it spyware, and forks have already been started. What seems to have happened is that Muse, the company that bought Audacity, decided to implement some telemetry data collection, which they had already announced they would do. There's basically no personal information with the notable exception of IP addresses. This isn't too bad in and of itself, except that this data leaves the EU, is shared with organizations in Russia and the US, and implementing this also means that they restrict the use of Audacity to people aged 13 or more, which seems to go against the GPL, the license that Audacity uses, and that stipulates that you cannot restrict access to the software to anybody. In the end, all the data collected is disclosed, and the privacy policy is quite clear, so I wouldn't call Audacity spyware. But the trust between Muse and the Audacity community seems to be broken now, and I personally will probably go on to use a fork because I am uncomfortable with the sharing of this data with external countries outside of the EU. According to StatCounter, it seems like Microsoft Edge, another Chromium-based browser, has passed Firefox in global market share. The Microsoft-made browser would now reach 3.4% of the market, where Firefox is falling to 3.29%. The major players are still Google Chrome with 65.27% of the market, and Safari with 18.34%, probably carried here by iPhones and iPads. This market share seems to include mobile data, which definitely doesn't help Firefox, as its mobile app on Android was a lot slower than anything else up until recently, and on iOS it's basically just Safari with another look, like all web browsers on iOS. I truly love Firefox, but it seems that we're now witnessing its slow death by 1,000 cuts, and the Chromium and Blink engine monopoly seems to be the clear winner of this battle, unfortunately for the web. Let's complete this video with some gaming news. Wine 6.12 was released, and it adds two built-in themes called Blue and Classic Blue, among other changes. It also fixes 42 bugs, including for games such as The Bureau XCOM Declassified, Diablo 3, Dark Souls 3, The Evil Within, Elex, Alien Isolation, Assassin's Creed 3, Heroes 3, Rainbow Six Siege, Sid Meier's Civilization 6, Stalker Call of Pripyat, or Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes. The Linux Foundation launched the Open3D Foundation, whose mission will be to handle an open-source, real-time, high-performance 3D engine. And this 3D engine is based on the one Amazon developed internally called Lumberyard, and that the company open sourced and gave to the foundation. Of course, it's early days, as the engine still only has Windows instructions to build, and the Linux client support isn't there either. Governance isn't really set up either, so we'll have to wait and see how that project evolves, and if the engine gets picked up by any developer to make open source games. It's still pretty exciting to have a major, modern open source engine to go along with the Godot engine. VKD3D received an update to version 2.4. VKD3D is the library that translates DirectX 12 calls into Vulkan and makes all these sweet modern games run on Linux. This new release brings improved performance in games that were GPU bound from 5 to 10% up to 20% in Horizon Zero Dawn. Apart from these major improvements in performance, we also get plenty of bug fixes for Cyberpunk 2077, Resident Evil Village, Necromunda Hired Gun, Dirt 5, or Horizon Zero Dawn. As always, this new release will probably be included in Proton very soon, so you'll get all these nice benefits right from the comfort of your Steam library. Following the latest NVIDIA drivers release, X-Wayland has been updated to take advantage of the hardware acceleration support that NVIDIA finally included. It supports OpenGL and Vulkan accelerated rendering, and has been added to an otherwise relatively minor bug-fix version of X-Wayland. This update means that users that have both the latest NVIDIA drivers and the latest version of Wayland and X-Wayland should now be able to play games on Wayland directly. That's one of the last missing pieces for NVIDIA support on Wayland, so let's hope that distributions pick these new releases up pretty quickly. And finally, the big news that just happened right before I recorded this thing, Valve announced officially their Steam Deck, a handheld device running a new version of SteamOS based on Arch and KDE Plasma. Now you might think that is still going to be very limited, because it's going to have to resort to Proton to run most games. But Valve is saying that they are working closely with BattlEye and Easy Anti-Cheat to integrate these anti-cheat solutions and overcome the biggest barrier to play a lot of multiplayer titles on Linux. It starts at $399 USD with options up to $649 for faster storage of a higher capacity and an anti-glare screen. It uses an AMD Ryzen APU with a 7-inch 1280 by 800 touchscreen, 16GB of RAM, a full controller layout, and a microSD slot. It basically ticks all boxes to be a super comfortable portable gaming console, with all your Steam games able to run on it. I'm super excited about this device, if only because all the improvements that will make it into Proton mean that Linux will now be able to virtually play any game that Windows has, including those that rely on anti-cheat solutions. I'm betting it will have a huge impact on Linux gaming and the Linux desktop as a whole. Now, let's see if I can justify spending 500 euros to buy a handheld that I will probably not really use all that much. And that concludes it for this video. Huge thanks to Slimbook for making it possible. If you don't know about Slimbook, they're a Spain-based Linux hardware manufacturer and reseller. They basically make everything that I use right now. I use their desktop, I use one of their laptops, I use one of their keyboards. They have devices for any use case, laptops, desktops, all-in-ones, small form factors, any keyboard layout that you might want, any price point. I left a link in the description below, just check it out if you need some new sweet Linux-based hardware. So, thank you guys for watching, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, don't hesitate to like and subscribe, and if you didn't enjoy, you can also dislike and tell me why in the comments. Now, if you want to help support the channel, you can also watch on Odyssey, or you can join my Patreon subscribers and YouTube members, and starting from $1 a month, you'll get access to a weekly patroncast and the right to vote on the next topics I'll cover. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!